Futures don't usually bleed like this in the middle of a trading day without a war, a terrorist attack, or a central bank shock. Yet within 11 minutes this morning, manufacturing futures were down more than 9%. Screens in Chicago flashed red. New York followed. Toronto hesitated, then steadied. And the Canadian dollar? It didn't collapse. It ticked up. That divergence tells you everything. Because 47 minutes before markets reacted, a closed-door trade meeting in Washington ended abruptly. What was supposed to be a high-stakes negotiation over tariffs between the United States and Canada reportedly collapsed in under 10 minutes, and now investors are recalculating risk across North America. Let's slow this down and separate verified developments from political theater. According to multiple officials familiar with the meeting, President Trump presented a revised tariff framework targeting Canadian steel, aluminum, and auto parts. The proposal included a substantial across-the-board tariff, reportedly north of 30%, unless Canada agreed to several structural concessions tied to dairy policy, electric vehicle manufacturing oversight, and new border cost-sharing mechanisms. Those conditions were not publicly announced beforehand. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, who entered office with a reputation shaped by his time as a central banker during the global financial crisis and Brexit turbulence, reportedly declined to engage under what Ottawa described as non-partnership terms. Shortly after, Canada released a brief statement signaling it would conduct a comprehensive review of cross-border trade dependencies, specifically referencing critical energy exports and supply chains. No threats, no ultimatums. Just a review. Markets heard something louder. Here's why. The United States and Canada operate one of the most integrated economic corridors in the world. Auto parts cross the border multiple times during assembly. Energy infrastructure links provinces to Midwestern states. Refineries, pipelines, power grids, agricultural supply chains, these systems were designed assuming stability. When stability becomes uncertain, markets don't wait for official press conferences. They price the uncertainty immediately. That's what happened today. Energy futures moved. Bond yields ticked higher. Equity volatility spiked. But here's the critical nuance. Canada exports commodities. The United States exports finished goods and consumer products at scale. In short-term trade friction, commodity leverage can carry outsized psychological weight because inputs are harder to replace than assembled goods. That doesn't mean Canada wins. It means risk becomes asymmetric. Now let's address the employment numbers circulating online. Analysts estimate that hundreds of thousands of American jobs are directly or indirectly connected to auto manufacturing supply chains that depend on Canadian integration. Some projections place exposure north of 400,000 roles if tariffs disrupt cross-border component flow. But exposure is not the same as immediate layoffs. Plant closures require planning. Contracts include contingency clauses. Tariffs can be delayed, negotiated, modified, or suspended. However, what corporations cannot tolerate is prolonged ambiguity. Executives at major automakers, Ford, GM, Stellantis, are reportedly running internal models right now. If tariffs are implemented at high levels and remain in place for weeks, production costs could surge sharply due to repeated border crossings per component. One often cited statistic, a single North American vehicle may cross the U.S.-Canada border multiple times before final assembly. Even modest tariffs layered repeatedly can compound costs. That's where investors begin to worry. Now step back from the numbers and look at the psychology. President Trump's negotiating style has long relied on leverage through market access. The premise, access to American consumers is indispensable. Threaten restriction, extract concession. An industrial partner embedded in North American infrastructure. Mark Carney understands systemic leverage differently. As a former central banker, he thinks in terms of flows, liquidity, risk premiums, and dependency networks, not headlines. Walking out of a negotiation can be theatrical or strategic. If you engage in public sparring, you escalate emotion. If you disengage and issue a technical review, you shift the battlefield to markets. Today's market reaction suggests investors view Canada's energy position as credible leverage, even if Ottawa has not formally restricted anything. That distinction matters because at this moment, no pipelines have been shut, no oil shipments halted, no electricity flows cut. What exists is the possibility of regulatory review, and markets hate possibility more than reality. Now consider domestic politics. Many of the states most economically intertwined with Canadian manufacturing, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, are politically competitive. Economic disruption in those regions carries electoral consequences. Republican lawmakers from border states are reportedly fielding calls from corporate leaders seeking clarity. Business associations are urging rapid de-escalation. At the same time, Trump's political base has historically supported aggressive trade posture framed as protecting American industry. This creates tension between populist messaging and industrial interdependence. If tariffs are implemented aggressively, near-term consumer impacts could include higher vehicle prices, potential gasoline volatility, and upward pressure on inflation expectations. Bond markets have already responded modestly. Treasury yields edged higher as traders assess the possibility that inflation risk could complicate Federal Reserve policy. But again, policy is not yet enacted. There are three plausible trajectories from here. First, a negotiated recalibration. Behind the scenes, trade representatives refine the proposal. Canada offers symbolic concessions, perhaps adjustments in dairy quota frameworks or EV production safeguards. The White House reframes the outcome as a strategic win. Tariffs are delayed or reduced. Markets recover. Second, controlled escalation. Tariffs are signed but implemented with phased timelines. Canada counters with regulatory scrutiny rather than immediate retaliation. Both sides test each other's tolerance without crossing into full economic rupture. Third, sustained confrontation. Tariffs activate at scale. Canada enacts measured energy export slowdowns via environmental review processes. Supply chains seize. Inflation accelerates. Central bank policy tightens. Political fallout intensifies. At present, signals suggest markets are pricing risk of Scenario 2, not Scenario 3. But sentiment can shift rapidly if rhetoric hardens. Let's also address the global dimension. Allies and competitors are watching. Trade reliability influences defense credibility, diplomatic alignment, and long-term strategic planning. If the United States struggles to maintain predictable economic ties with its closest neighbor, other partners may diversify exposure as insurance, not necessarily as punishment, but as prudence. Conversely, if Canada overplays leverage, it risks appearing destabilizing in a G7 framework built on interdependence. Neither side benefits from prolonged uncertainty. Now consider the structural truth underlying all of this. North America's economic integration took decades to build. It rests not just on treaties, but on habit, on trucks crossing borders daily without friction. Once friction becomes normalized, habits change. Corporations redesign supply chains. Investors demand higher risk premiums. Energy buyers seek alternative routes, even if costlier, simply to reduce vulnerability. That process is slow, but once initiated, it rarely reverses fully. So what happens in the next 72 hours matters disproportionately. If Trump's administration signals openness to dialogue, markets may stabilize quickly. If Ottawa clarifies that review does not equal restriction, volatility could ease. But silence magnifies speculation, and speculation fuels sell-offs. One more point often overlooked. Trade brinkmanship is not purely economic. It is performative. Leaders must appear strong to domestic audiences. Walking back publicly requires narrative control. Expect face-saving language on both sides if compromise emerges. Now let's ground this for viewers at home. If you live in Michigan, Ohio, Ontario, Alberta, this is not abstract geopolitics. It's tied to your job security, heating bill, and grocery prices. However, panic rarely aligns with outcome. North American leaders understand the scale of mutual dependence. Institutional pressure, from corporate boards to labor unions to energy producers, pushes toward resolution. But until resolution appears visible, markets will continue to react. Today's red screens were not proof of collapse. They were proof of uncertainty. And uncertainty, when layered onto tightly integrated economies, moves billions of dollars in minutes. The key question is not who won the meeting. The key question is whether both governments recognize the cost of escalation faster than markets punish them for it. Because in highly integrated systems, leverage cuts both ways. And once risk spreads through supply chains, it doesn't ask for permission. We'll continue tracking official statements, tariff implementation timelines, and energy export updates as they develop. For now, what we have is a collapsed negotiation, a recalculating market, and two governments facing a decision: escalate for optics or recalibrate for stability. The next move will determine which path North America takes.